Good day, and welcome to this 10 minutes on tenant-to-tenant migration, where this topic is going to be Active Directory migrations. My name is Mike Weaver, and I'm a Microsoft MVP in the Office Apps and Services category, and thank you for joining today. We're going to cover a few topics on Active Directory migrations for a tenant migration scenario. When we talk about an Active Directory migration, many think about just user accounts, but really there's a lot more to it than that. There are, of course, directory sync and user accounts aspects of an Active Directory migration. Depending on the migration path you're going to take, this can have different flavors in different situations. But there's also lots of non-user objects. This can include groups, external users, service accounts, application registrations, and so much more. It also includes workstation account and server accounts, because often if you're doing particularly a tenant migration for a merger, acquisition, or divestiture, you may need to shift these to a new on-prem domain or even to Azure Active Directory. Also tightly tied in with an AD migration are often file shares and network storage, and that's because classically this aligned to the Active Directory team or domain controllers or the server team. So often we need to move home shares and shared group network shares at the same time as an Active Directory migration. Let's talk about the very classic scenario for an Active Directory migration. So this is where we need to do directory sync and user accounts. And this is a classic piece of migration in the Active Directory space. Really what you're doing in a migration is you're doing a sync where you're going to create objects in the target Active Directory, target tenant, and you're going to sync the properties as much as you can. Over the years, this has gotten really robust, very known, and pretty much the majority of the attributes and things can come over. You certainly have to make some decisions in this, things like SID history and other touchy topics in your planning, but in general, this is how it works. If you're doing a Office 365 migration from on-prem in the same directory, there's certain classic AD sync options. In a cross-tenant scenario, you typically want to use a third-party tool, or there are some preview programs popping up to do some of this sync. When you're doing the setup for this, you need to define what's going to sync. So is it a subset for a divestiture? So maybe only a department or a city or a country, just a subset of users that are in scope. Or maybe even very directly select users that are going to migrate, or the other way, you're not going to sync a subset of users. So you need to define that scope early, understand it, and get guidance on it, and then ensure that the scope is correct. It's often a good idea to do a search and confirm that whatever scope options you want is in fact getting you the desired users that you want in scope for migration. The other talking about is what direction. Is it going to be one way, so only migrating attributes, data, passwords in one direction, or maybe not even passwords? Or is it going to be bi-directional? So if this is particularly a long-term scenario where the environments are going to coexist for a long time, if a user changes a password in one directory, do you want that to sync back to the other direction? Or perhaps an attribute, a title, a phone number changes in either directory, do you want it to go to both? So more or less is what is the source of truth, or are both the source of truth? As we move into non-user objects, these are groups, external users, service accounts. This can get pretty complicated, particularly when we say groups, because it's a general term to mean a lot. This can be security groups, Office 365 groups, distribution lists, dynamic distribution lists, all those other kinds of groups. For large organizations, this can get a challenge because some orgs have policies against using certain kinds of groups. And some of these have content behind them. Office 365 groups is a great example where that is a group that holds users in it from an Active Directory perspective, but behind the scenes, there's all sorts of data and content that can be there. So sometimes you will not include those in your Active Directory object syncs, and you'll hold off and do the actual data migration, and that'll be creation, and you may not do an actual sync of those objects. So when you're creating AD sync options and looking at tooling, you want to understand what your scope is going to be in these pieces. Other aspects to consider are external and guest users. So external users that maybe need to be registered or you have a federation with for either the source and target company as part of the merger acquisition work, or external firms, very tight partners that you're working with where you collaborate a lot and you may have a certain federation in place to be able to share FreeBusy information or a network or OneDrive SharePoints and so on. Also handling guest users. Are you going to create all the guest users in the target tenant and go through the invite process automatically, or are you going to let them organically regrow? Those are things that you need to decide and how you handle that. Service accounts, again, that's a project by project basis. Many will opt not to automatically create service accounts, maybe shared mailboxes, but not actual service accounts. This needs to be part of your planning and strategy and is a great opportunity to clean up because these service accounts certainly can get out of control and be out there for quite some time. Application registrations, same process as service accounts. It just, again, there is application data a lot of times behind these or other things using them. So it's not just as simple as just recreating it. What is it being used for, and ensuring that the new credentials are shared for both service accounts and application registrations. And we talked about federation and trust. Are you going to recreate these? So are the partners from the company that are in the company that's been acquired going to automatically just come over? So are you going to recreate all of them? Depending on what kind of federation and trust is in place, you may need to get the other firms involved to set that up and ensure that that happens in an efficient manner. So again, more than just Active Directory migration accounts. And then workstation accounts and server accounts. All sorts of migration paths that can come into play here and to consider, and this falls under the Active Directory migration piece. Are you going to not reformat the users and or not give new devices, which is becoming more and more popular because we can just reconfigure them. However, you need to move these off into a new on-prem Active Directory controller, so on-prem AD to on-prem AD, or as part of a modernization plan. So maybe the target uses Azure Active Directory for its workstations as well, or they are trying to move to that. So they're gonna, while they're working on the device, put it in Azure Active Directory. This can include hybrid join workstations. So these are usually on-prem workstations that are connected to Active Directory, but have the mini join or hybrid join into Azure Active Directory for Office 365 and some of the security features that come into that. The other aspect is Azure Active Directory join workstations to Azure Active Directory join workstations. As we've seen this continue to increase, we're going to run into it more and more in the tenant migration piece. The other thing to keep in mind is if you have applications that will not support Azure AD authentication, and I put this under the workstation aspect because that really drives some of your workstation plans. If you have a lot of applications that are using other forms of authentication that are using leveraging on-prem Active Directory controllers for authentication and they can't be moved over, you have to find a solution, whether it's a bridge back to an on-prem environment or replacing the application or whatever it may be, you have to address that. So some users, maybe if there's a small amount using those applications, may keep their workstation account on-prem and everybody else goes to Azure Active Directory, or you may find you have too many applications that aren't ready and you're going to need to go to an on-prem Active Directory environment. Again, file shares and network storage sometimes fall into Active Directory migration, and this is where you need to move those traditional SIFS file shares up to OneDrive, SharePoint, wherever it's going to go, or a NAS device maybe. Some of these are already on NAS devices, and the department shares that go with it. The other aspect are user profiles, roaming user profiles. If you're moving the ID, are you moving the profile data over? How is that going to be handled? That is a 10-minute session all on its own, and especially if you add in TS profiles, terminal server profiles, it can get really, really interesting. So what you're going to do with user profiles is a key part of the AD migration decision, and these need to be in lockstep, even if you're in an environment where these file shares are managed by another team. These can be attached to Windows servers or NAS devices, but still typically falls into the Active Directory piece. Not all firms adopted OneDrive, and some firms didn't move all their data, but adopted OneDrive. So a lot of firms are actively using OneDrive and not really using their on-prem, but it still exists. And that comes down to, do you need the data? Is there a legal requirement to keep it? And all those lovely discussions. Tenant migration sometimes forces migration because if you're going to migrate this data anyway, you might as well move it to a modern source with or modern environment like OneDrive or SharePoint. So sometimes a lot of firms may still have in their target these file shares and network storage department shares, but will choose to adopt the modern piece in migration because if they're going to migrate, they might as well migrate it once and be done instead of touching it again in a year. We talk about the phases of an Active Directory migration for a tenant to tenant. This is a typical process that we see. We'll see a gal sync. So this is day one close. We just need to get all the employees in each other's address list, global address list, so that we can send information and see each other and start collaborating with our new colleagues. This typically isn't done in pre-close announcements, but is done at close so that you can actually take the walls down and start the initial forms of collaboration. We then hit the coexistence phase, and somewhere between the first two steps is usually where a light federation is set up so that you can do free busy lookup and be able to share calendar data. So even in the very early days, that gets set up usually pretty quickly. And even a lot of those partner connections we talk about are set up mainly just for free busy calendar sharing. But you need to also move into the coexisting collaboration phase, and how long you're here really depends on how long you intend to be there for. If you're going to do a very quick migration and you do a lot of them and you think you can do your 500,000 user project within 60 days, you may not set a lot up in coexistence and move right to a migration piece. If you're a Fortune 50 enterprise with 120,000 users and need to figure out what you're going to do, then you may set up a really more advanced coexistence piece because it's going to be around for a while, and the inefficiencies that come in by not having it set up will start to creep in, and there will be increased pressure to provide some of these coexistence very upfront. So that is really custom to the size of your project and how fast you can move. You'll then hit the content migration, and that's again in here with Active Directory because the ID migration path has to follow the content migration path and how these objects are moved, manipulated, what they're set up as, everything that comes into it. Next is sometimes a computer migration. Sometimes this happens with the content move. Sometimes it's after the content move. And sometimes we're still running into the classic environment where you send users new equipment. Whatever the decision is or process is, a computer migration typically runs into here. With that, again, is the application migration. So any on-prem applications or applications that were not part of Office 365 will come into play and need to be planned for. A key part of looking at Active Directory logs is trying to find applications that are using it for authentication to help figure out what's out there and to redirect. If everything goes to plan, you'll be able to look at those logs and not see any traffic anymore and start being able to shut things down and close out. And that's where you may do things, especially if you set up coexistence with domain sharing, either through a third-party solution or some of the preview programs that are out. You'll want to formally move that domain over and close out all the aspects of that tenant. And please, in a tenant-to-tenant migration, when you're done, please ensure you delete your tenant. There are data breaches that occur when people are not maintaining their tenants anymore and they're not deleted. And believe it or not, those can hang out for a really long time. So be sure you're following the instructions from Microsoft on how to delete your tenant. We talked about some of these already. Then the final AD migration tasks. You also, as part of the cleanup, you need to remove everything here. So as I mentioned in the deletion, be sure you follow the instructions. These are the instructions that are there. You need to remove all external and guest users, application registrations, ensuring that you got everything and everything's moved over. They're difficult to recover. There's some automation there, but still the secrets and things like that can be quite difficult. Move Azure resources. So if there's Azure resources out there, you got to get them over to the new place. On-prem syncs need to be turned off. Any reliant applications from on-prem that are leveraging that directory need to be moved over. Users and licenses, they all need to be removed, and you have to move the subscriptions and all that data, and then you can issue your deletion request. Once it's gone, it's gone. So ensure that you don't have any open legal discovery cases or anything that you need to get off of it. Again, please ensure this is done to prevent data issues and prevent charges and things like that. But please ensure you do it carefully and that all activity is done because these are permanent tasks. If you do have a tenant-to-tenant migration coming up and you have wanted to look at our Active Directory migration solutions at Quest, go ahead and follow the sign-up page here where you'll be able to do a free trial and take a look and try this out for yourselves, including a lot of the scenarios that we talked about today. And don't forget to check out the other 10-minute sessions on Tenant Migration Series where we're covering planning, coexistence, directory sync, domain move, support, email, SharePoint, Teams, and this session, Active Directory. Thank you for joining.